Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story tonight is about the naval exercises conducted this week by the United States with its allies in the Quad, short for Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. The U.S. is conducting two military exercises in Asian waters this week involving Quad allies Japan, Australia, and India. This was stated by the U.S. Navy. The USS Nimitz and the USS Ronald Reagan were deployed to the South China Sea twice this month. This week, the Nimitz was in the Indian Ocean for exercises with the Indian Navy. Rear Admiral Jim Kirk, commander of the Nimitz Carrier Strike Group, said in a statement that Monday's drills with the Indian Navy helped improve the interoperability of their forces. India's relations with China have also been strained after a deadly clash on their disputed border in the Himalayas last month, prompting calls in India for closer security ties with the United States and its allies, including Japan. Separately, the U.S. strike group led by the Ronald Reagan was carrying out drills with naval forces from Japan and Australia in the Philippine Sea, U.S. and Australian officials said on Tuesday. The exercises are due to end on July 23, which is tomorrow. The exercises come as military rivalry between the United States and China is intensifying. Just days ago, United States and China's claims of sovereignty in the disputed South China Sea were illegal. To analyze what's going on, we are joined by Professor Michael Clarke, former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute and currently a visiting Professor of Defense Studies at King's College, London, former Commodore Syed Mohammad Obaidullah of Pakistan Navy. Let me begin with Professor Clarke here. Professor Clarke, I remember we've discussed this before also, not specifically in relation to naval exercises, but generally in terms of the overall tenor of relations between the United States and China. How significant are these naval exercises? Are they in a response to what the U.S. and allies allege to be China's showing of flag in the South China Sea?
I mean, these exercises go on fairly regularly. The United States conducts these sorts of exercises usually every year. But this particular year, they've made a big issue of what they call FONOPs, the freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, which has really upset Beijing. And the idea of aircraft carriers being used in these FONOP operations is quite a big symbolic escalation, and then to go on from these incidents in the South China Sea into this joint exercise off the Nicobar Islands and Andaman Islands, which is the north entrance to the Malacca Straits. So these joint Indian, American, Japanese and Australian military maneuvers are symbolically very significant because, as you said in your introduction, we can see coming together here a strategic quad, a group of 4 countries, all of whom want to demonstrate that China's behavior in the high seas is unacceptable. So that's the political and the military significance of these sorts of maneuvers.
Okay, I perfectly understand the narrative of sort of show of force or the symbolism, as you rightly said, of force. But at the same time, there is a mechanism where China and the South China Sea littoral states are in talks in terms of, the UN law of seas, UNCLOS, and others. So wouldn't you agree that it would be better to give that kind of dialogue mechanism a chance rather than projecting force in a way that's likely to get Beijing to retaliate?
Well, what the Western allies have tended to say is that those talks are going nowhere. And nobody expects them to, because Beijing always says, oh, well, we have to have talks, which is fine. But remember that Beijing was in front of the International Court about 2 years ago in The Hague on exactly this issue of the South China Sea. They were taken there by the Philippines, who had arguments about the jurisdiction, and Beijing lost on every single point. the International Court did not uphold a single of one of the claims that Beijing made. And so what the international community said is, look, if we're having talks, that's fine if they're meaningful, but they're not meaningful. And the fact is, you have no legal basis to what you're doing. Now, of course, Beijing doesn't see it that way, but that's the way the Western allies see it, so that they feel that they have to demonstrate the freedom of the seas through these pretty big naval maneuvers. I mean, after all, an aircraft carrier is not just a big ship, but it carries with it a strike group of 2 or 3 frigates and 2 or 3 destroyers and 1 or 2 submarines and quite a lot of air power. So these are very big operations, simply because aircraft carriers bring a lot of naval force with them wherever they go.
Absolutely, they're the force multiplier platforms. But stay with me, Professor Clarke. I want to sort of get to Commodore Obaidullah and sort of narrow down the perspective of this debate before I sort of open it up again. Commodore Obaidullah, I want to talk to you about the sense of this growing sort of naval exercises and the whole concept of interoperability between the United States and the Indian Navy. Now, considering that we are locked in a conflictual framework with India for various reasons, how does the Pakistan Navy see these exercises, and what kind of threat perception do we have from these?
As far as naval exercises are concerned, in the whole ambit which you just narrated, the biggest aircraft carrier of the world, USS Nimitz, only had passage exercises with the Indian Navy while going from Pacific to Indian Ocean for deployment, and it only had passage exercises, which really means that while passing through this area near the coast of Nicobar and Andaman Island, they had this exercise. Pakistan Navy has a history of having exercises with almost all navies of the world, including United States Navy, Australian Navy, Japanese Navy, and you name any navy. This is not specifically to any particular navy. We had very regular, intense exercises with the Americans, with the British, and middling exercises was the name given to it. And also, in the current scenario, we do have such exercises, or in fact, more intense exercises with Western navies, and all navies of the world go to the other places in the world all over and have exercises. So to draw an inference of Indian Navy having exercises with the US Navy near Nicobar and Andaman Island, whether it poses any threat to us, I don't think so. These are routine activities. But of course, when you look at it in a political and more broader perspective of containment of China, and then the relationship between the Indians and the United States and Pakistan and China, we will arrive to different conclusions maybe, but from purely a military point of view, a naval point of view, these exercises are routine matter, and particularly I am referring to the exercise which was conducted, which is called passage exercises with the USS Nimitz with the Indian Navy.
That's a very interesting analysis, Commodore. Let me take this, what you have said, to Professor Clarke. So, Professor Clarke, Commodore Obaidullah is saying this is a passage exercise by which I assume this is, one strike group, exiting a body of waters and entering another body of waters. And so there's got to be some kind of protocol. And since the Indians have those naval stations there, I guess that's where the Indian Navy came in. Although the US Navy statement talks about interoperability. So I'm assuming interoperability here also includes protocols other than simply combat protocols. What would you say to what Commodore Obaidullah said?
No, I think the Commodores are quite right that navies exercise with each other all the time. And the Pakistan Navy has got a very good reputation for exercising with lots of different actors. I mean, the fact is that navies can actually exercise together much more easily and flexibly than ground forces, armies, or air forces. Because with navies, you simply bring the ships together and then you just make sure that you've got good procedures in place and protocols to avoid any incidents or deconfliction. You look at the signals that you're using. You make sure that you can understand each other properly. The big question with exercises, particularly with aircraft carriers, is whether the frigates and destroyers of another nation would be trusted to protect an aircraft carrier. And that's the really big one, because aircraft carriers are such big investments. They're so important in modern naval warfare that if a country is happy to have its allies protect its aircraft carrier, that implies a very great deal of commonality and interoperability. And even more than that, as is developing in some navies, can an aircraft carrier take the aircraft of another fleet, another navy? Is it compatible with its systems to be able to land on and take off again aircraft from a different navy? So there's all these things to consider. But in this case, remember that these exercises north of the Malacca Straits are not just between any navies. These are four very important powers in the political balance of forces in East Asia. We're talking here about America, India, Japan, and Australia. Those are the four most important powers in this part of the world. And the Americans are also saying that the Nimitz may well be back later on this year in the Bay of Bengal for another set of exercises that wouldn't just be passage through the Nicobar and Andaman Island areas. This would be somewhere else, probably further north, towards the northeast coast of India, in the north part of the Bay of Bengal. So I don't think we can say that these exercises are purely procedural. There is a really important political message behind them. Now, whether they will have that effect or whether they'll do more harm than good is something that we'll discover in the next 3 or 4 months. But they are clearly intended as more than the average procedural exercise. They are intended as an important signal to Beijing.
Okay. Professor Clarke, final question and a quick answer. I mean, this is kind of tangential, but it's interesting because there's some sense that China's power projection is essentially sort of sweeping up 3 theoretical frameworks, Mahan's framework, Mackinder's framework, and Spikeman's rimland theory. Now, I find that a very interesting way of putting what Beijing is doing. Given your background in political science and war studies, give me your sense of whether you'd agree with this assessment.
Well, yes, because China is such an important power, it's both a Mahan and a Mackinder power, which is to say that it has both a land power element, and it is it's a continent almost all of its own, and it has an Asian mission towards its west in the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's also a maritime power because it has a role in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia. And you can see from the development of bases that the Chinese Navy, has bases it can use at Hambantota in Sri Lanka, increasingly at Gwaidar. They will use it for that. There's a military base being developed in Djibouti. So from the West's point of view, we can see a naval mission developing, which is more or less inevitable, I think.
What's being referred to as the string of...
That's exactly right, the string of pearls. And it worries Delhi a great deal. Whereas the Chinese worry about Indian forces moving up to the border in the Himalayas, the Indians worry about the string of pearl bases, which would give China a great deal of maritime leverage across the Indian Ocean and into the Arabian Sea. And I think that is probably historically inevitable. It will happen. Thank you so much. I'm also joined by Dr. Stephen R. Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies, International Christian University in Tokyo. Professor Nagy, we're talking about the exercises, the naval exercises, U.S. Navy conducting exercises with the Quad allies.
Give me a sense of how you look at it in terms of its symbolism, in terms of the signaling and the rest of it.
Well, I thank you very much for having me. First and foremost, I think it's important for us to understand that we have Australia being included in the Quad and the Malabar exercises in the South China Sea. And this is symbolic, but I think it's premature to say that it's transformative. And why I say that is that one-time joint training means little. But if we have a continuous track record of joint training between India, Tokyo, Washington, and Canberra, this is going to have significance for pushing back against China's assertive behavior within the region. I'd like to add, though, I think that the four countries only cooperating is not enough. I think that we have to move forward on a Quad plus alpha. What I mean by that is that we include other countries that in the maritime exercises, and those maritime exercises could include actors such as New Zealand, Canada, even South Korea, as well as European states such as Germany, France, and the UK. It's meaningless one time. It needs to be continued many times to have a real punch and a real strong message to Beijing.
Well, you talked about New Zealand, you talked about South Korea, you talked about Canada. I'm not so sure Canada perhaps could be included in Quad Plus. But I'm not very certain whether South Korea would want to sort of, get into an arrangement which Beijing has begun to see as hostile. I would say perhaps the same about New Zealand. Vietnam, perhaps, yes, but I'm not even so sure about other South China littoral states because while they have their issues with China, they also have a dialogue mechanism with China with reference to the disputes in the South China Sea.
I agree with you, and I think this is where we could envision a quad plus alpha that's basically two-track. The first track is more hard security issues, and the second track is working on non-traditional security issues. For example, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, joint exercises, search and rescue, and as well as enhancing maritime domain awareness. So these are areas where, as you mentioned, South Korea, New Zealand, and Canada may not be willing to confront Beijing directly, but they may be willing to lend their capabilities, not their capacities, their capabilities and their relationships to strengthen the Quad plus Alpha kind of initiative to send a strong message to Beijing that it is not playing by the rules that other countries are accepting. At the same time, it sends the message that they're not willing to have a combative or confrontive approach to Beijing. Rather, they would like to shape its behavior so that it falls in line with the rules-based behavior that most states within the region agree upon.
And if other powers were to accept that China is the major power in the region, that perhaps China would come back to the rules-based order, whether it's based, you have the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. China also lost against the Philippines in the tribunal. So it seems to me that there are likely to be two stages here. One stage where China is staking claim, the other stage where others having tacitly accepted that China begins to look at the area as an area where it has to allow other littoral states and generally shipping and everything, commercial shipping and everything, to go through South China Sea as before, as normal. And I don't think that at this point, China has actually tried to do anything that endangers commercial shipping.
Well, I do think that China's long-term strategy has been they've been transparent about it. As early as the 1950s, Admiral Yu, a key figure in the modernization and transformation of Chinese naval policy and foreign policy, really outlined in the 1950s that China needs to dominate the South China Sea, and it needs to be able to dominate the first and second island chains to be able to push back the United States and other powers within the region. So with that in mind, I agree with you that the Monroe Doctrine with Chinese characteristics is very much, I think, in their thinking. But there's another way to view this, and that's along the lines of Liebestraben, that German concept back in World War II, where the Germans tried to expand their territory to create living space to meet some of China's security concerns. And I think that is another way to interpret Chinese behavior within the region. Now, you said that China's, is taking this moment of opportunity to push some of its claims, and I think this is very true. The COVID-19 pandemic really has provided an opportunity for China to be more assertive on many fronts, and one of them is in the South China Sea, but we also have them along the Indian border, the Taiwan Straits, as well as Hong Kong. So I think that China is using the global chaos, and I think the distraction, and of course, the way the United States president has handled the COVID crisis domestically to secure some of its core interests. And before, I think, some of the really serious domestic pressures on the Chinese economy and Chinese society really start to hit in the next 2 or 3 years.
Okay, thank you. So that was Dr. Nagy speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss Pakistan's efforts to reset diplomatic ties with Bangladesh. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about Pakistan's efforts to reset diplomatic ties with Dhaka. Relations have deteriorated between Islamabad and Dhaka since the current Prime Minister Hasina Wajid took power. Relations between the two countries have remained tense for the last many years, but especially after the decision taken a few years ago by Hasina Wajid's government to try and execute several leaders of Bangladeshi Jamaat-e-Islami on charges of committing war crimes in 1971. In 2016, Pakistan's National Assembly, the lower house of parliament, passed a unanimous resolution condemning Dhaka's decision. Later, the Bangladeshi government refused to approve the appointment of Pakistani High Commissioner for 20 months. A fresh name for the post was approved by Dhaka only last November, and Pakistan's current High Commissioner took charge in January this year. Earlier this month, Pakistani envoy held a rare meeting with Bangladeshi Foreign Minister A.K. Abdul Momen. Foreign Office sources say certain developments provide an opportunity for a reset, but caution against considering this as a breakthrough. To discuss this further, we are joined by Ambassador Rafiuzzaman, a career diplomat and former High Commissioner to Dhaka, and Asif Munir, a Bangladeshi journalist based in Dhaka. Let me begin with Mr. Munir here. Mr. Munir, what is your reading of the situation? How do you look at this meeting between the Pakistani High Commissioner and your Foreign Minister?
But I see this as a positive sign. And of course, there are issues and gray areas in the relationship, but I think that can be smoothened out. And it's a question of kind of meeting halfway and looking also the other perspective from both sides, from Bangladesh and Pakistan. I believe that both the current regimes in Bangladesh and Pakistan, they have a positive view. Already there were some developments, as you mentioned, but also within SAARC or within regional cooperation. There have been instances of closeness, but also sometimes distances.
Mr. Munir, Pakistan in 1974 recognized Bangladesh during the Islamic Summit. We've had relations, as you know well. There seems to have been a political fault line within Bangladesh where every time Ms. Wajid's government came in, it leaned more towards India, and every time there was a different government, Begum Zia's government, that it leaned more towards Pakistan. So I think that kind of seesaw needs to be done away with. Do you think that is something that, I'm sure the Pakistan is prepared to do that, but do you think that is something that Bangladesh can do?
I think setting that aside will be difficult. But I think there could be some kind of a middle ground, which I mentioned, that, acknowledging certain things. I mean, of course, the hardline position for some Bangladeshi activists would be like some kind of apology. I'm not even talking about that. But I'm saying that acknowledging that there are certain areas, kind of acknowledging the emotions as well. But I think setting that aside as far as Bangladeshis are concerned, that will be very difficult. But I still believe that even without setting it aside, it's possible to move forward together.
Okay, stay with me. Let's take this to Ambassador Siddiqui. Ambassador Siddiqui, you had a long tenure in Dhaka. Give me your sense of relations and what Mr. Munir is saying with reference to a reset.
To begin with, let me say that today, only today, our Prime Minister took the initiative and made a phone call to Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina this afternoon. And it was, I must say, it is like a breaking of the ice. But having said that, I think it's a long way to go. We should not read too much into it. According to one of my very dear friends from Bangladesh, who, having got the news, called me up and was very excited. And he said, isn't it a silver lining on the horizon? I said, it indeed is. But I would say it's still blurred. Our relations with Bangladesh, as Mr. Munir mentioned, in fact, I could not hear him properly. But as I gathered, that he was talking about middle ground. And I agree with him. And I think this middle ground was taken by Pakistan in 2002 when the former president, Pervez Musharraf, visited Bangladesh, and during his visit to Sawar, the cemetery of the martyrs, he said, and he kind of noted down, registered his sentiments in the book. And then again, he reiterated those in the banquet hosted in his honor by the then Prime Minister Khaleda Zia. So that created lots of goodwill amongst the Bangladeshis, and it was like moving towards an apology. I would say that, Pakistan is going to apologize for what happened in 1971 because, as you mentioned, that it is again a very emotional and sensitive issue for us. But this Prime Minister's conversation with the Prime Minister or Sheikh Hasina this afternoon, in my view, does kind of, open up an avenue to move ahead. Although, it is the path is strewn with lots of obstacles, but I think there is some light at the end of the tunnel.
Okay, stay with me, Ambassador Siddiqui. Let me go back to Mr. Munir. Mr. Munir, let me approach this issue from a different angle, which is Bangladesh-New Delhi relations. Now, under Prime Minister Hasina Wajid, traditionally, relations between Dhaka and Delhi have been very close. But it seems that in the past few months, since the middle of last year, there have been approaches taken by Delhi that haven't really made Dhaka very happy. And certainly, there's been popular sort of discontent with those approaches taken by the BJP government. Give me a sense of where those relations stand, because it seems to me that also has a certain kind of tangential, sort of impact on, Islamabad-Dhaka relations.
You're right. In terms of the relationship with Delhi, I think even not just recent times, I would say that over the years, even with the Sheikh Hasina's government, relations with Delhi has not always been smooth. It has its ups and downs, and there are sort of border issues, border tensions sometimes. There's the sharing of water issues. So there are issues that has not been resolved for many years. But there are some kind of, civility in the discussions at the diplomatic level that, yes, we are trying to resolve it. But in the end, has not been resolved yet. Also, in terms of the Rohingya refugees, there has been sort of some tensions. And of course, India has reiterated that it's a friend of Bangladesh and wants to help. But there have been some tensions about that also. The position India takes with Myanmar, or regarding some of the Rohingya refugees who are in India and the possibility of them wanting to cross over to Bangladesh. Of course, there are other issues in West Bengal, border issues, the Bengalis who migrated after 1947, all of that. So I think, yes, in the recent years, it has sort of had some tensions. There are still kind of, friendly discussions, but there are sort of undercurrents which are there, and that has not been resolved yet. The discussions continue. So this can also be kind of looked at how the geopolitics, move forward in this region. I mentioned about SAARC, but in terms of as we see from the outside, from the civil society, it's a dead horse. It doesn't get anywhere with the SARC, although there has been sort of a lot of expectations. So there has been some good examples before, but recent times in terms of the geopolitics in this region, there has not been much progress in recent years. So yes, the relationship with Delhi would sort of have some impact on relationship with Islamabad, but I wouldn't say that it would have a major impact. I mean, Islamabad and Dhaka could work on things on their own as well.
Fair enough, fair enough. Thank you so much. That was Munir speaking with us. Very quickly, back to Ambassador Siddiqui before I wrap up. How optimistic you are in terms of a reset, especially when Hasina Wajid is in power?
Ejaz, if you recall, a few months ago when you took me on your program, I said that I'm a compulsive and I'm an inveterate optimist. So I stay that way. And what is important in our relationship is after this Prime Minister's conversation with the Bangladeshi Prime Minister is that we need to have a consistency in our relationship. We need to have, optics are very important and FONAP is very important. There are so many mechanisms lying between, that have been signed between the two countries, for instance, like the Foreign Secretary bilateral consultations, which have been lying pending for the last God knows how many years. And there has been no movement on that. So I think we need to, both the governments should realize that, staying away from each other is not going to help any of the two countries.
So basically, engagement is the way forward. I'm sorry, this is all the time I have. Thank you so much. That was Ambassador Siddiqui speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.